just joining us, I've been with Sikich for about 2.5 years now. Um, Before that, I've worked in security engineering roles, DFIR roles, digital forensics, and incident response. And then before that, I came up through help desk, sysadmin, network engineering, and that sort of way. There's me about in the before times, before COVID, 200 pounds ago. I know, strange how COVID takes a toll on you like that. And yeah, and here's just a little bit of an introduction about Sikich itself. In total, we have about 1,600 plus personnel. We have people all over the world, in the United States, out and outside of the country as well. We have about 40 plus years of accounting and tax auditing experience, and we overall foster a collaborative culture. And I can attest to that because the team I work with is fantastic. Just a little bit about the services we offer outside of the technology space. Sikich first started as an auditing, accounting, and tax consulting firm with services such as assurance, tax, site selection, business incentives, etc. And then they kind of expanded into advisory and technology. So on the advisory side, we have some human capital and payroll, workforce risk management, regulatory quality and compliance initiatives, marketing communications. And then on technology, we do more than cybersecurity as well. We work with ERP services, CRM services, even managed services. We can help you migrate to the cloud if that's what you want to do, digital transformation, so on and so forth. And to dive in deeper into a little bit more of our security services we offer, in addition to pen testing, we do forensics investigations. We offer vulnerability scanning with a world-class vuln scanning team. We do compliance and risk assessments. We do pen testing, so that's the team. If you want a pen test, you may work with me, or you'll work with another one of our fantastic pen testers. We do audits, and we can help with remediation. And then we also do a cool thing called security awareness training, and that includes we can do a number of different things: tabletop exercises, training your employees on how to recognize phishing, those sorts of items. Okay, so let's dive into the webinar for today. That's a little bit about me and Sikich and what we do here as a company. So application security is a little bit different in how you test it. Instead of the regular reconnaissance phase, vulnerability detection phase, exploitation phase, you kind of have to test each individual thing. And there's a group called the Open Web Application Security Practice, or OWASP, that created a top 10 list of issues that affect web applications. And we're going to kind of go into each one of these just a little bit, talk about each one of them. OWASP is a fantastic organization. They have tons and tons of resources out there to kind of help guide you on your application security, help guide you on issues to look for, so far and so forth, and what issues pen testers should look for. I reference OWASP a lot when I do application security tests. So let's go ahead and dive into number one. And number one is broken access control. So in a nutshell, what it is it just enforces policies so that users can't act outside of their intended purposes. So this could be items like resetting another user's password, gaining access to an administrator page that isn't supposed to be there, accessing information that they're not supposed to. Just like I said, failures typically lead to an unauthorized information disclosure. You can modify data, even destroy data in a worst case scenario. And this brings to the first war story I'm going to tell for the day is whenever we see applications and they're using object references in them, for those unfamiliar with what an object reference is, sometimes in the URL, you'll see a letter or a number or something that references, and the application actually uses that identifier to reference an item in the database or wherever you're keeping your data. Maybe it's an image in a cloud storage account or a bucket somewhere, and they can access that item. So what we typically like to do is we can just change that value. So we'll say if it's like, I don't know, something example.com/user/0, we'll just change that to a 1. Can we access the next user's account from there? If we can, that's an issue because then we can reset that user's password, access their profile. Maybe they have some sensitive information on there. If it's a shopping cart application, maybe they have stored payment information on there, et cetera, et cetera. Now, some things that you can do to prevent these types of things are enforce deny by default always, except for, obviously your public resources that you're going to allow access to. So always enforce that deny by default and implement access control mechanism one time and then reuse them throughout the application. I know for a lot of frameworks, they do have pluggable authentication frameworks that you can use, authentication and authorization. Django being specific one I'm thinking of. I know that Node has its Express.js. I believe that's what it is. I'm sure there's some for Java packages as well. The impact of some of these things is it can expose sensitive information to unauthorized actors. You can even insert and again delete information that was sent to them. All right, perfect. That moves us on to number 2, which is cryptographic failures. So for those unaware, I'm sure a lot of you know, but cryptography is just the act of encrypting secrets that shouldn't be exposed out there. So you take a secret or something that shouldn't be known, you mangle it in layman's terms, and you store it in somewhere so that only you can access it. Now, what you can do to unmangle that string is you have a key or a cipher or something of that sort that says, this is how you get that mangled string and decode it and read the original output of it. And this is kind of a high level of encryption for those that were unaware. And cryptographic failures cover a multitude of different things for your application. They can cover browser to server. So when data is in transit or transit data, they can cover data at rest as well. So data sitting inside of a database, on disk, a number of different things. Mainly the big thing that helps guide these things are your compliance regulations. So GDPR, PCI, HIPAA, etc. PCI has very strict standards for how you handle that cardholder data, and it needs to be protected in such a way. And using your compliance regulations, again, can help you classify your data processed, stored, transmitted, whatever it is by the application. And then the last thing to help prevent these types of errors is don't store sensitive data longer than you need to. Sometimes that's easier said than done. Some compliance regulations have you store data for 7 years, for example, if it's for accounting and tax purposes. Sometimes it's shorter than that. Again, always kind of default back to your compliance regulations and do the best you can to encrypt that data. And another thing on that is sometimes your compliance regulations don't have items around it. However, when we do application pen tests, one of the things we look for is, can we retrieve sensitive information from the database? Is it protected somehow? One of the things that I personally like to look for is if I can retrieve user passwords. Again, those things shouldn't be stored in clear text. They usually are hashed, or if they are stored in clear text, they are far and away, but they should never be stored in clear text. A lot of the times we do see they're either clear text or just base64 encoded. And base64 encoding is not encryption. All you do is take that and you can convert it really easily back into its plain text string, and you can see the user's password from there. Some impacts from cryptographic failures do include sensitive data being exposed accidentally, and you can incur fines from various governing bodies such as PCI, federal United States government for HIPAA, or even the European Union for violating GDPR. Number 3, this one's my favorite, injection. It just sounds mean. People usually outside of the IT security space and outside of IT in general have heard of SQL injection. It just sounds mean and evil. This happens when user data is not specifically sanitized to prevent against these types of things. So you can have SQL injection, that's the most common one, but you can also have NoSQL injection. That's kind of a newer one for your NoSQL databases like Mongo, Memcached, those sorts of things. You can inject operating system commands if your application is configured in such a way to run commands and it's not properly sanitizing your input. Cross-site scripting is also included in this. And then a newer one is that we've kind of seen out in the wild is server-side template injection or client-side template injection, where you can inject the template code into the application. It'll render it by the application, and then you can you basically have control of either the server side or the client side of the application. Prevention of this is you need to properly validate, filter, and sanitize your user input. Again, we see this one a lot out in the wild. It is not an easy one to fix, but there are some key things you can do. For example, you can do HTML entity encoding, you can do URL encoding, you can always pick up on specific strings that are happening. You can implement a WAF as well, just to kind of help bolster your defenses against these things. Again, security in depth, it's like an onion type thing. Some of the impacts that we can see from this are the client side of the application can be controlled by malicious JavaScript. There are sensitive items that can be exposed from this again, such as SQL and NoSQL injection or template injection if you're storing secrets in your templates, and then remote code execution at a worst case scenario. Again, we can see this by dropping a file using SQL injection and then executing that file if you're running PHP, or with template injection, you can actually interact with the underlying operating system using either Python or Java or even Razor pages. You can do server-side template injection if you're a .NET shop. Awesome. Moving on to whatever number this is, I believe it's number 4, is insecure design. Insecure design isn't necessarily a vulnerability in the application. It starts at the very beginning. So when you're initially designing the application, these are architecture flaws, and these are not following best practices. So when you do application design, what you want to do before you even write a single line of code is take into account, okay, this is the design I want from a high level. What are kind of the threats that we're going to be facing? Where can user input be injected? Where can they interact with this application? And this is just the basic idea of threat modeling, is interacting with the application, seeing where threats can come in on all sides. It could be they're directly interacting with the application. It could be, oh, they've injected code into our build pipeline and those types of things. So you just want to take into account every scenario where the application could accept input or does accept input. You can interact with builds, those sorts of things. Again, prevention of this is to follow the principle of least privilege, and that is only give rights that they need to perform the functionality of their job. Don't overextend those rights. Impacts can lead to different items down the road. So these can lead to failure to account for injection attacks. These can lead to failure to account for DDoS attacks, those types of things. These don't necessarily, they lead to later issues down the line, if that makes sense. All right, next one is we have security misconfigurations. So these are kind of related to the last one, only when you're actually implementing your application, you're just leaving defaults in place. You're leaving features that are unnecessary out there in the open. So for example, if I deploy an instance of something from like the AWS shop and it has default credentials in there and I don't change those, that's one of the things that this relates to. Even security features that are disabled or not configuring properly, log SIM agents, EDR, anything of that sort. Kind of the things that you could do to prevent these types of things is to create a repeatable infrastructure and application hardening process. Using infrastructure as code can help this quite a bit, and using a configuration management suite can help with this quite a bit, like SCCM, Ansible, SaltStack, whatever you have. And always use a minimal platform that you need to perform its job. That kind of just cuts down on a lot of the extra fat that we have in our general applications. You only want them to be able to do the job necessary. So disabling extra features and components that aren't needed, and always make sure that you have clear documentation to follow. So if you're using Apache, make sure you follow that clear documentation. You can use third-party resources for help, but always make sure to verify it against your documentation on there for your specific build. And some of the impacts that we see from this, again, are application servers that have built-in passwords, sensitive web error messages that expose the application stack. It can actually expose some of the code that we see from the application, and default cloud permissions on there. So for example, if I have a regular EC2 instance, I can take control of that if it has just its standard role and permissions that we have. And we'll talk about a vulnerability a little bit later that can kind of help us with that. Next on our list is vulnerable and outdated components. This one comes down to all about inventory management, keeping track of your software bill of materials, knowing what your application is made of. So these can include your JavaScript libraries, framework libraries, the base framework itself, hosting servers, anything that is used as part of your application. Always make sure you keep track of it, keep track of what versions there are, and always subscribe to a CVE list to kind of get information on what's going on out there in regards to your application. Again, some of the prevention things is always make sure you know what your application is made of, and then create a good patch management process. Again, if you're a Windows shop, use SCCM, Intune, what have you. If you're more of a Unix and Linux shop, use Ansible, SaltStack. Always make sure to keep things up to date if possible, or whatever patch management solution works for you. And then always obtain components from your official sources. You don't want to reach out to weird, strange sources to update your components, because a little bit later, we're going to talk about software data and integrity failures that relates to this as well. And we'll kind of see why we always want to reach out to official sources. Some of the impacts from these is you can accidentally install a malicious NPM pip package or whatever package management solution you're using, even if you're using weird apt sources or DNF sources for your Linux and Unix distributions, you can install a malicious package accidentally. And then you can also install an outdated component version if you're installing from an unknown and unverified source as well. Take a swig of water real quick, just because. That doesn't relate to OWASP. That's just another tip. Always stay hydrated. Okay, so now moving on to identification and authentication failures. These relate to verifying a user's identity. These relate to session management, any session weaknesses that we can identify, or even not taking into account, like we said before, those automated attacks that can sit and brute force passwords on them where user accounts don't lock out. One of my favorite things to do is always go through the password reset process whenever we do an application security test. Usually you can find some way to, whether it's timing the application as it's returning data to you, or through the password reset process itself, it'll actually tell you, sorry, we don't have this email on file. Oh, okay, let me try another email. Ding, we sent you an email type thing. A better approach to that would be just a generic error message that returns back and says, if we have your email on file, we'll send you a password reset function. Some of the things that you can do to prevent some of these other items up top, like I said before, is implement multi-factor authentication. So either a push to your phone, a time-based one-time code, password, that sort of thing. And you can also implement weak password checks for your users. So before you actually commit them to storage, you can actually run them against a blacklist of words. There are some products out there that can help you with this, and say, sorry, this isn't allowed. It needs to meet a certain criteria. The philosophy is if you protect your users using your application, they won't, a malicious user won't be able to discover anything deeper inside the application itself, and you're kind of helping them protect themselves type thing. Ensure that registration and account pathways are protected against enumeration attacks. Relates to how I like to go through that password reset process again, see if I can get a list of valid usernames. And then we can also implement automated password attack prevention, such as a CAPTCHA, timeout, certain number of times you can do a lockout on the account, etc. Some of the impacts we see from this are, again, you've heard me say this too many times, this slide, but enumerate valid usernames. You can password spray against those weak credentials, and then you can access a user's or administrator's account if your password attack is successful at that point. All right, we're getting close to the end here. So next on the list is software and data integrity failures. So that relates to code and infrastructure packages that do not protect against modification. Again, installing from untrusted sources, repositories, etc. We saw a lot of this recently in the past year, but the big one that comes to mind when people think of that is the SolarWinds attack. That big SolarWinds attack was state-sponsored actors got in. They were able to modify an update package and push it to about 100 customers, with about 50 or so succeeding. I don't remember the exact numbers on it, but that was a huge deal that they were able to modify update packages, push them to customers of SolarWinds, and the customers did not know. The application did not help protect itself against them. Auto update features generally don't properly validate the integrity of packages before installing. We see this a lot in home networking equipment as well. Your routers won't actually double check to make sure that the firmware that it's installing is legitimate. It came from a legitimate source. So some of the things that you can do to help prevent this is implement digital signatures to verify packages. So digitally signing each update package you have before pushing it out to either your application or a user's instance of the application. Always make sure your npm, pip, Maven, NuGet, whatever package manager you're using is installing from a known and trusted resource, whether that's one that you control with Artifactory or whether it's a legitimate source from PyPy or the npm store or Maven. Even with some of those third-party sources like PyPy and the Node package manager store, you want to make sure that it's the legitimate package. You want to double check the documentation. We're seeing a lot more nowadays that state-sponsored actors are putting out fake name packages that look very similar but have just enough of a difference to where it allows them malicious access into your backend infrastructure. And some of the impacts we've talked about and touched on already, so we'll just go ahead and move past that. Coming down here, number 9 is security logging and monitoring failures. So this one isn't necessarily a vulnerability in the application itself. It's a vulnerability and a weakness in how are you logging information? How are we seeing if an attack is actually happening against the application? And one cool thing that I think we do really well here at Sikich is when you do an application security test, we'll give you the chance to submit to us a sampling of your logs. We can hop on a screen share. We'll actually go through and see, hey, is this enough information to determine, is an attack actually happening on the infrastructure? Could we actually determine, what happened as a result of these logs? And we'll make recommendations based on them. So again, description of this is attackers have become really good at hiding their tracks. What is an attack versus a legitimate request? Are we logging too much, logging too little? Are we logging important events? Are we logging jump? It's a very fine balancing act to pull off. So you got to say, are we logging way too much stuff that's not important? Are we not logging enough? It's a very tightrope act to walk. Cost also plays a big factor into it if you're using a cloud SIM versus on-prem SIM. Just lots to think about for this. Some of the impacts that we see from this are attacks are taking place, but alerts aren't being triggered because it's not picking up on it properly or nobody's paying attention to alerts. A long time ago, that's how the Target breach happened, was alerts were going off, nobody was paying attention to them. Lights were on, nobody was home. And breaches can happen, nobody is aware before it's too late. Again, going back to alerts are going off, nobody's paying attention to it. And then final one that they added as number 10 is server-side request forgery. This wasn't on the top 10 before, but with the inclusion of cloud resources, it made the cut this time. So what is server-side request forgery? It is an application is fetching a remote resource without validating the user supplied URL. So you're forcing the application server host or whatever it is, whether it's the application itself, to make a request on your behalf. So that could be fetching an image, fetching, a file from somewhere, scanning a website, any number of things it could be. Some of the impacts that we see from this are you can do, I like to call it a dirty port scan, where you can scan internal resources and see, okay, what else can I get access to? What's actually returning data from there? You can gain access to local files, local sockets in some cases. It kind of depends on how the application is set up, but it is possible to do that, especially Docker sockets, those types of things. You can access the metadata of cloud resources. Some of you are familiar with that 169.254 IP address repeated. You can actually fetch credentials from there if you're not careful. Many blogs out there on how to do this. And you can see like there's a lot of people going from how to go from SSRF to taking over a cloud server. And in some other cases, you can abuse other resources to create remote code execution. So it's become a big enough issue to where it's made the cut at number 10. And some of the things you can do to help prevent this is you can segment your networks. You can enforce a deny by default. Again, comes down to principle of least privilege. There's kind of a theme in all of these. Sanitize and validate your user input, relating back to injection attacks, that sort of thing, and enforce the URL schema port and destination with a positive allow list. So user inputs where they want to fetch the resource from, you validate it against a whitelist and say, okay, we'll allow it. If not, you deny it and say, nope, sorry, that doesn't work. So those are kind of the big ones that we're going up against in application security. Those are kind of the big issues that we look at. So now we're going to take a little bit of a turn here. And how do we actually develop a robust application security program within our company, within our jobs, within whatever organization that we're a part of? And OWASP has a very, very good way to do this, and they follow what's called the paved road approach. So the first step in this approach is you need to identify the gaps and goals of your AppSec program. So what goals do you have? Are you wanting to catch vulnerabilities before they're released to the public? Are you wanting to play catch up? What's kind of the goal of your AppSec program? So once you identify some of those, then you can move into number 2, which is the paved road culture. So the paved road culture is a partnership between development, operations, security. You all act as one team and come together as one cohesive unit instead of building kingdoms around your organization. You need to continuously improve, measure, detect, and replace insecure items that way. And it's not all going to happen overnight. It's going to be incremental over time. So you take these little wins where you can get them. Once you've planned on how to bring your teams closer together, then you start implementing the paved road and you say, okay, what's the first project we want to do? Do we want to start implementing regular vulnerability scans? Do we want to implement a patch management program? How do we go about doing this? How do we start bringing these teams closer together? You start on these little projects, start bringing everyone closer together, start tearing down walls, bringing them closer. Number 4 is then you migrate all upcoming and existing applications to the paved road. It's easier to start with brand new ones and start them on the paved road and then migrate back. But it is possible to start with existing applications and move them into the paved road first before you start with new applications. Kind of depends on your culture and how your goals align with it. And then number 5 is testing that the paved road is mitigating issues that are found in the OWASP top 10. If not, again, you go back and you start building incrementally again, easy wins. It doesn't have to be an overnight thing, just as long as you're doing a little bit. We want to implement patch management. We want to implement a bill of materials type thing. Easy little projects to start, and then you can tackle more complex ones over time. And then once you keep repeating that process, you keep repeating and building into a mature application security program. So the paved road lifecycle actually aligns real well with something called DevSecOps. So here's kind of a brief history and what DevSecOps is. So software development used to operate on what's called the waterfall method, which is you did the design phase, then the build phase, and then this, and then this. And it was all just one straight shot down, like a waterfall. And it took forever. And one small change needed from whoever you were building the software from, say they needed to implement a way for a user to change a profile picture or something, you would need to go back to the design phase and restart all over again. And that often disrupted this method. So later, the agile method was then introduced to create shorter development times. This is where you focus on, instead of creating a whole big project at once, you just do little additions, little minimum viable product to get out there. And you keep integrating and implementing these until you get further down the line. So with this method, that was fantastic. However, faster deployments were then needed because the development process was getting faster and faster. The operations team couldn't keep up with deployments. So engineers at Yahoo brought these two teams closer together and created development operations, stuck them together, created DevOps. And that's kind of part of the paved road culture. You're starting to see it build. And that was fantastic because building and deploying was fast now. But the big bad security guy came in and stopped these types of things from happening, saying, wait, we need to review these for compliance. We need code reviews. We need all sorts of things. There are legitimate reasons for this. Don't get me wrong. However, compliance shouldn't always be an item to hide behind. It should be, we need to make sure we're meeting these and moving forward still. And in addition to being the big bad security guy, security teams are often way smaller than developer teams. You'll often have 6 security engineers for 600 developers type of items. So we needed a way to scale our security tooling without doing manual activities. And so then we started creating automated security tools and started integrating them into the build process and the deployment process. And thus all 3 teams were brought together to create kind of a DevSecOps culture. That's kind of what we're seeing the shift to now. So DevSecOps and paved road, kind of one of the same. And some of the core tools that we use inside of DevSecOps are called static application security testing tools and dynamic application security testing tools. So let's start in with SAST tools real quick. So static application security testing examines code to find flaws. It'll read your source code. It'll start following data flow chains and saying, I think you might have an issue here. It's really easy to get started because these tools can be run from either a local machine inside of a build pipeline or even inside of a Docker container most of the time. This is the easiest way to get started with building kind of that paved road or DevSecOps culture. However, they are prone to high levels of false positives and can take a long time to complete scans if you have a fairly beefy project. And then on the other side of this, you have dynamic application security testing. So this is where we're actually going to take our application, build it, run it in an environment, and we're going to check for security vulnerabilities there. Very similar to vulnerability scanning using a traditional vulnerability scanner. The good thing about these tools is you do not need extensive knowledge about a programming language. These tools are designed to be run against a number of different applications. However, with that being said, is it does lack coverage in some of the different frameworks we've seen. It's not as robust in certain ones, just because of the limitation of not knowing the underlying application architecture and language that it's built in. And then one final thing that we kind of use in a DevSecOps culture is called software component analysis. Now, this is kind of a subset, I like to put it, in SaaS technologies, and it is a technique to find vulnerabilities in third-party components. So again, keeping track of your software bill of materials, comparing them to a list of hashes of those packages and seeing, okay, are there any vulnerabilities related to this package? No, this package, yes. Okay, what are the vulnerabilities type things? And it is the easiest tool to use to get started in the pipeline, just because it doesn't take a whole lot. Really, it'll read your requirements.txt, your packages.json, or packagelock.json if you're a node shop, and those types of things. Less false positives than traditional SAST, however, because it does use checksums of files, it is very limited to just looking at dependencies and those types of things. So with that being said, I'm going to take you on a little field trip real quick over to the OWASP site, and we're going to look at some of these tools real quick. So bear with me while I get this up and running. Perfect. So I'll give that just a minute so that everybody can see my screen. And this first screen that we see here is our source code analysis tool. So this page kind of gives us an overview of SAST tools that we can see. You can see there's a whole lot of strengths associated with it and weaknesses. So you can go through, read these in your own time. I've kind of taken the big ones, summarized them in the slideshow. And there are selection criteria that can help you kind of make a decision based on what tools you should use. Now, a lot of these tools are not endorsed, or OWASP doesn't take preference in tools, neither does Sikich. You can use any tool that you want based on what your needs are. Each tool has its own strengths, each tool has its own weaknesses type thing. And the important thing is you can see kind of the name, link, who owns it, the licensing, the platforms it runs on, and any notes that you can see. So for example, this .NET Security Guard, it's an open source application. It can do .NET, C#, VB.NET, just easy ways to scan source code and that sort of thing. And again, a lot of these tools can be run as a standalone executable on a desktop machine, or they can be integrated into a pipeline. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. So now, if we scroll down a little bit, there's Bandit, Brakeman, just a whole lot of tools, and you can see each description of each. You can see what languages they support, what languages they don't support, a whole bunch of good information. Over on this page, we see different vulnerability scanning tools, or DAST tools, that we can use. A little bit less information on these, but if you've worked in IT before, a vulnerability scanner or these types of tools, they run the application and start poking at different things in an automated fashion and try to pull out relevant results and say, I think this might be relevant for your application. You may want to take a look at it, type thing. Very similar to the last one, we could see the name, the owner, the license that is needed for it, different platforms, and then any different notes for it. So down here at the very bottom, there's one I want to point out in particular, is the Z attack proxy, which is made by the OWASP team in general. It is open source and it runs on Windows, Linux, Mac, and it is under the Apache 2.0 license, so it is free. But there is just a whole lot of them, and I've used a number of different ones to do different pen tests, just for different reasons, depending on what the situation was. Okay, moving on to this next link right here. This is our software component analysis page, and you can kind of see, again, there's a whole lot of information, how to get started in this, finding outdated components, component age, different component types, repository trust, just different tips and tricks to help you in your application development process. And down here at the bottom, we have our tools listing again. Again, we can see name, owner, license, platforms, and a lot of these are built into the framework that you're using. So for example, NPM Audit, just a free tool with NPM. You just run NPM Audit, check it against the application itself. Bada bing, bada boom, there you have all of your packages, vulnerabilities that are output to there. And so that's kind of the idea behind these different things, is to just get caught up to speed, pick a tool that works best for you, and go from there. So now we're going to jump straight into a little bit of a demonstration on how to get started in sort of these. So on my GitLab page, this is my fantastic juice shop that I've built. I lied. It's not mine. It was made by OWASP. It is a fantastic tool to get started in kind of seeing different vulnerabilities to get started with. So it's just called OWASP Juice Shop. All I did was clone it, push it up to my own GitLab instance, and go from there. So in these different platforms, you have files that you can use to actually start the build process whenever you make a commit, whenever a certain trigger happens. Let's just dive into mine real quick, and we can see kind of an example of how DevSecOps works in an actual pipeline. So here I have 3 different stages, and a stage is just, that's what it is. It's just a stage in the build process. So I separated it out into 3 just to make it easier. So we have our software component analysis stage, we have our SAST stage, and we have our build stage. Don't have a DAST stage for you guys. I just wanted to demonstrate the SAST portion of it to show you how easy it is to get started with it, and you don't need any infrastructure. So first, we'll start with our NPM audit scan. So we're going to use just a standard node image or node.js. And this is part of the SCA stage right here, the software component analysis. And we're just going to start running these different commands. Juice Shop was a little bit tricky. I had to run some custom things to get it to actually run the audit command. So then we're just going to audit and output to our JSON file. And we're going to take that artifact always, even if it fails, and we're going to push it up to our GitLab and see kind of what the results were in it. Now, a very important thing is to, no matter what tool you use, is to allow failing when you first integrate these into the pipeline, because your build tools will return an error if there is a vulnerability that it sees. So you always want to make sure to allow the build pipeline to fail and not be held up on a security tool when you first get started into these. And then the second thing we run down here in the second stage, it's called SemGrep. It is an easy SaaS tool to get started in. You don't have to use SemGrep. I chose SemGrep for simplicity, just because it's free and open source, and I've used it before. But there are a number of different things that you'll want to use specific to your application. And it's just as easy to get started. So the script that we're going to run is just, we're going to scan, we're going to output the results to a JSON file, and we're just going to scan the directory that the source code is in. We're going to take that artifact back to GitLab, and we're going to go from there. And then finally, our build job, where I don't actually push it anywhere, I just build it. And so now, when we actually committed this to one of our pipelines, you can see I have some warnings here because of the software component analysis and the SaaS stage here. Well, if we go over to the software component analysis phase real quick, we can see, yeah, the job failed. There were errors that occurred, and this was because NPM Audit found vulnerabilities in the package I was using. If we go back to our jobs, back to pipelines, excuse me, go back into the pipeline itself. If it decides it wants to load, there we go. And we go into the SaaS portion of our build job. We can see there is our scan status. We had a bunch of different languages, some TypeScript, JSON, YAML, HTML, Docker files, Bash, and the rules we were using were just the open source or community rules. So we can see that we had 76 findings. It uploaded the artifacts. Oop, didn't mean to click on that. And we can see that the artifacts were uploaded here. If we click on these files, we can see we can browse the findings from here. And let's look at the NPM audit one first. So it just gives us a raw JSON. So if we go and start looking at the vulnerabilities, you can see all of the packages that we had in this Juice Shop program. So let's look at Express.js. Ooh, high severity, fun. So let's look at the item that happened. So, okay, there was an authorization bypass in Express.js. There's a GitHub URL to the issue itself. Severity is rated at high. Okay, what do we need to do to fix it? Well, there's a quick fix available. We need to upgrade to version 8.4.1. So we were under 5.3.3, as you could see. We just need to upgrade Express.js or Express.jwt, excuse me, to that latest version, and that should resolve our software component analysis issue for this package. Now, always be careful when you're upgrading packages in on an application. You always want to make sure you thoroughly test it, make sure all the features you're using previously are working. If you need to make any additional changes, it would be prudent to do so. Normally, you're not making this big of a jump from under 5 up like 4 major versions. However, it can happen depending on your environment. Let's take a look at our SemGrep scan results real quick. So as we can see, we have a whole lot of results right here. And these different numbers are just different vulnerabilities. So let's pick a number. Let's pick 23. Actually, you know what? Let's pick 42 because that is the meaning of life. So we have just a check ID or the rule that it used. We're going to go dive into extras, and we can say that detected use of parse XML data passed into it. Okay, well, what does that mean? Function with the no end field set to true. This can lead to an XXE attack if untrusted data is passed into it. So that gives us kind of a little bit of a hint as to what's going on. So, XML external entity is happening on this. Okay, let's take a look and see kind of the impact. It's high, confidence is low, so this could be a false positive, could not be. It's up to an application security specialist to kind of determine what's happening here with that. Again, with SAST, you're going to get a lot of false positives initially. You're going to have to go through and kind of determine what's real and what's not, but it gives you an idea of some of the items that you're looking at inside of your application. And then we can see that the file that it scanned was, where is it? It's around here somewhere. Path is routes file upload.typescript. So that is the file that it scanned. That is the rule that it did, and that is the item that it detected. So that is kind of all that she wrote for that. Now we're going to transition back over to the slideshow. Perfect. We'll give that just a minute to pop up again. Make sure what's happening on my screen. Okay, there we go. I think I'm back now. Perfect. We went through that demo really quick. Last couple items I wanted to touch on are, so with all these tools that we have, we don't need to pen test anymore, right? That's not necessarily true. These are just items to help you prepare for a pen test, kind of look for items beforehand so you kind of know what problems you need to address. Once you address those problems, then it's time for a pen test, because pen testers are better at finding flaws between applications that interact with one another, or microservices that interact with one another. Abstract tools can help you find the low-hanging fruit, where pen testing can help you identify deeper underlying issues in the application, such as business logic vulnerabilities that can happen, and those types of things, or different microservices interacting with each other that may not show up using these tools. And then final thing is just a couple different resources that we used here. And thank you all for attending today.